The 60s, apart from the fact that things were pretty basic in the early 60s, it was also a period of time when people became interested in wine for the first time. The general feeling was in the 60s, if you drank wine, or in the early 60s, if you drank wine, you had a real problem. And we know a lot of the people today who still got that problem. However, the point was that wine was not was not accepted socially until the early to mid 60s. What happened then, of course, was that suddenly the whole of Australia became interested in wine. Maybe not the whole of Australia, but certainly the southern part became interested in wine. And the wine they were interested in was red wine, because we were basically red wine producing at that stage. The white wines we produced, while they were quite good, they didn't have the quality and the enormous variety and perspective that white wines have today. They tend to be coarse and a bit harder and not as pleasant. So in the 60s, it was red wine. Red wine, and predominantly Shiraz, and once things started there was a big demand for Shiraz, and people planted Shiraz. So this went on, I guess, until the middle 70s, when once again technology changed. We first had refrigeration here in 67. We had our first stainless steel in 72. This also brought us problems. In the old days, we used brass pumps and we used a lot of metal in the industry, mainly because we had no option, and this produced all sorts of problems. Then, of course, with the introduction of stainless steel, a lot of those problems were gone. We didn't have the problem about metal contamination, which created enormous problems in the old days. But with stainless steel, it also brought its own problems, because suddenly we had the advent of hydrogen sulfide appearing in our wines, which in the old days, using the older equipment, it was neutralised. But this didn't happen. So we had another learning curve in the 70s to learn about how to handle stainless steel. With the market, once again, the market had changed dramatically. As we moved into the 70s, we had better refrigeration. We were able to produce wines with residual sugar. They were light, fresh, attractive wines. And suddenly, instead of people wanting to drink hot, warm wines, they wanted to drink cold, white wines, which was, as we're a hot country, made a lot of sense. So in the 70s, Riesling suddenly became king. It was a great period, but unfortunately, in that period, we'd had a lot of Shiraz planted and not much Riesling. So white wines became much more popular. The Hunter were planting Semillon, South Australia and Victoria were planting Riesling. Chardonnay was probably, someone thought was a name of a racehorse at that stage, had never been heard of. But certainly Riesling was king during the 70s. As the 70s wore on, I think people began to mature a bit. The wines being made, the Riesling being made were quite sweet at that stage. So the style was to dry them off quite a lot. This led to the introduction of Chardonnay, and as the varieties went on, it's quite interesting to see the evolution of varieties in the Australian industry. We went from Shiraz to Riesling, then probably to back to Shiraz again, and then Chardonnay. A lot of Chardonnay was grown, particularly in the 80s. I guess if we look at booms and busts, during the 60s and 70s was certainly a huge evolution and a huge development stage for the Australian industry. By the early 1980s, very little wine was being exported, and it was all being consumed locally, and we had a great following for wine in this country. Unfortunately, like what normally happens, our supply outstripped our demand, and suddenly by the middle 80s, we were looking down the barrel of excess fruit, dropping in prices, and at that stage the vine pool scheme was brought in South Australia, where they were paid to pull out grapes. But luckily for Australia, and Australia is a lucky country, Chernobyl went off in Russia, and this created a demand for clean wine. Particularly in countries like Sweden and Europe, they wanted clean wine, and Australia was one of the few sources of clean wine. And this was the start of the boom in our exports. We had cheap grapes, low dollar, surplus fruit, and this really got the export push going. And exports kicked off in the early 80s and up till have been progressing up until just the last, I suppose, 4 to 5 years, when the demand has tapered off and is actually now starting to fall. So we went through a boom up until the late 70s, and then a drop off in the early 80s. We boomed due to exports during the 80s and 90s. By the end of the 90s, we also had a small recession, where I think once again our supply outstripped our demand, and we were forced to pull our horns once again in the late 90s. Since then, once again, exports have taken over, and the demand has been enormous. With varieties, they've come and gone. We saw certainly Riesling was certainly big in the 70s. Certainly in the 80s and 90s, Chardonnay has been quite spectacular. The reds have come back in the early 2000s, but also we have things like Sauvignon Blanc, which has been, which is a variety I personally don't like very much, but it's a variety which the public like, and certainly it's been a boom variety in the early 2000s. I think probably it's on its wane now. We're seeing Chardonnay make a recovery, we're seeing Riesling make a recovery, we've seen things like Pinot Gris coming into the system as well, plus a bit of Viognier and some of the other varieties. And I think with our white varietal scene, it's been quite innovative, and we've seen a lot of changes in the last 20 or 30 years. Reds have been a little bit more staid. That certainly we had Shiraz in the 60s, in the 80s. I guess Shiraz has been our staple red wine diet. It's been there all the time. While it's gone up and down in popularity, it's always been there, and it's always been fairly strong. Cabernet has also been fairly stable. Pinot is at last starting to come into the Australian wine consumer's diet. I think that Pinot is a variety I particularly like, but we are seeing Pinot now making some inroads into what we're drinking in Australia. We have a lot of other red varieties which are once again on the periphery. We have a lot of Italian varieties come in. All this I think is good for the industry. I think one of the big problems we've seen enormous changes in marketing in Australia. In the old days, we sold wine direct to the public, and then we sold direct wine to stores. Now we have the big supermarkets coming in, and they are really dictating largely how we sell our wines today. Luckily, we still have a good restaurant trade in Australia. A lot of the small people like ourselves are doing a lot more with mail order, and there's a number of ways we can sell your wine, but certainly the supermarkets are big and powerful, and it is certainly something that we've got to look at, and how we deal with them, I don't know. I guess it's the lack of competition between the two big supermarkets which is the main concern. At the moment, it's now 2012. One of our big problems at the moment, of course, our exports are starting to fall due to a high Australian dollar. And at this stage, the way we're going in this country, with our enormous volume of exports in iron ore, coal, I can't see our dollar falling to get us into a position where we can once more export to markets profitably. Having said that, however, while we're in the bottom of the third bust that I've seen, I would have hit the bottom, and I think in Australia we're good winemakers, we're innovative, we can work hard, and I think we still have a great future for the wine industry in this country.